In the late 1930s, a team of out-of-work architects arrived at a house in Iberville Parish, Louisiana, carrying tape measures, drafting boards, and a large format camera. They were part of a federal program with an unglamorous job: measure old American buildings before they fall down, so that at least the drawings survive. Nobody was living in the house. Nobody had lived in it for more than a decade. One entire wing had already collapsed. There were cracks running through the south portico, and the foundation underneath it was quietly sliding toward the river. They worked their way through it anyway, floor by floor, counting. They reached 75 rooms. That number is the reason anyone remembers Belle Grove at all. 75 rooms, 62 feet tall, 122 feet wide, columns 30 feet high, topped by Corinthian capitals carved from solid cypress, each capital 6 feet tall on its own. The largest private house built in the American South before the Civil War, and one of the largest built anywhere in the country in the 19th century. One of those 75 rooms was on the lowest floor. Small, windowless, heavy door. It was a cell. Hold that detail. It will matter more later than it does now. 14 years after the surveyors packed up their drawings, the house was gone. It burned in a single night in March of 1952. No one was ever charged. No one rebuilt it. 6 years after that, what was left was bulldozed flat. Today, the site holds a residential subdivision and a historical marker at the corner of a state highway. Here is what makes this a mystery rather than a sad story. Buildings that large do not simply vanish. Something has to keep them alive. A family, a fortune, a state, a museum, a paying audience. For nearly a century, Belle Grove had none of them. The richest house in the richest agricultural region in America could not find a single owner willing or able to keep the roof on. The fire did not kill Belle Grove. The fire arrived at something that had already been dead for a long time. The question is when it actually died. And that question starts nowhere near the house. In 1802, Louisiana produced about 5,000 hogsheads of sugar. A hogshead was a barrel holding roughly 1,000 pounds. By 1853, Louisiana produced 449,000 of them. That is a 90-fold increase inside a single lifetime, and it did not happen because of the soil. The soil had always been there. What changed was the physics. For 2 centuries, sugar was made by boiling cane juice in a row of open kettles over open fires. It was crude, wasteful, and dangerous. It burned enormous quantities of fuel, scorched the sugar, and required people to stand over roaring flames, ladling boiling syrup by hand. The man who ended that system was born in New Orleans in 1806, the son of a white engineer and a free woman of color. His name was Norbert Rillieux. He was educated in Paris, and by the age of 24, he was teaching applied mechanics at the École Centrale. He worked out something elegant. If you enclose the evaporation in vacuum chambers, the juice boils at a lower temperature, and the steam thrown off by the first chamber can be captured and used to boil the second, then the third. Heat that had always escaped into the Louisiana sky could be made to do the same work 2 and 3 times over. He patented it in 1843, and again, more broadly, in 1846. By 1849, 13 Louisiana sugar factories were running his apparatus. Within a few years, the design had spread to Cuba, Mexico, and across the Caribbean. The result was more sugar, of better quality, from less fuel and less time. And this is where the consequences begin to run in a direction Rillieux never controlled. Because when a crop suddenly becomes far more profitable per acre, planters do not simply enjoy the profits, they plant more acres. And in the Louisiana of the 1840s and 1850s, planting more acres meant one thing: buying more human beings. Rillieux's invention did not create slavery in the sugar parishes. It made it worth expanding. By the 1850s, the stretch of river between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, the 90 miles locals called the Sugar Coast, was home to roughly 1/3 of all the millionaires in the United States. In 1858, the Louisiana sugar crop was worth about $25 million. Money that concentrated does not stay quiet. It has to be spent on something visible. John Andrews was not from Louisiana. He was born in Virginia in 1804 and came south around 1830, arriving in a society that had been running on French and Spanish Creole family networks for a century. He was, in the local vocabulary, an outsider, an American, someone with no name in the parish. He founded Belle Grove in the 1830s in partnership with a physician, Dr. John Philip Reed Stone. In 1844, the partnership dissolved and Andrews took full ownership. From that point, his holdings grew the way successful sugar holdings grew, relentlessly. 7,000 acres spread across several plantations. 3/4 of a mile of Mississippi River frontage at Belle Grove itself. The most valuable dirt in the state because the river was the road. The federal census tracked his labor force with grim precision. 90 enslaved people in 1840, 135 by 1850, 148 by 1860. By the 1850s, Belle Grove was producing more than 500,000 pounds of sugar a year. Andrews had everything the Creole families had, except the one thing that could not be purchased, which was 100 years of standing. And this is where the personal enters the historical record and starts bending it. Andrews had a rival, a few miles up the river, John Hampton Randolph, another transplanted Virginian, another sugar man with the same problem and the same solution in mind. There is a version of this story told as a gentleman's competition. It was not gentle. Both men understood exactly what a building on that riverbank meant. Every steamboat passing on the Mississippi carried merchants, brokers, and planters. A house on the levee was not a residence. It was a financial statement, read daily by everyone who mattered, at a distance of 200 yards. In 1852, Andrews decided to make the largest statement anyone on that river had ever made. To do it, he hired a carpenter. Henry Howard was born in Cork, Ireland in 1818, the son of a builder. He studied at the Mechanics' Institute there, emigrated to New York in 1836, and the following year moved to New Orleans, where he took work as a carpenter for a local builder. He had no formal architectural training in the American sense. What he had was a builder's understanding of how things actually stand up, acquired with his hands, combined with an appetite for the styles arriving from Europe. Andrews gave him a commission with essentially no ceiling, and Howard produced the most ambitious house of his career. Consider what he did with the fundamental problem of the site. The Mississippi's floodplain is flat. There is no hill to build on, nothing to give a building elevation over its neighbors. Howard's answer was to raise the entire structure the full height of a basement floor, so that the house began where other houses ended. 4 levels, 62 feet of height on ground with no height at all. Then he broke the rules. The great river houses of that era were symmetrical Greek temples, matched wings, balanced fronts, white columns. Howard gave Belle Grove 2-story Corinthian porticos, which is the language of a Greek temple, and then hung them on a deliberately asymmetrical, irregular mass, which is the language of the Italianate villas, then coming into fashion in Europe. And he did not paint it white. Belle Grove was pink, a pale rose with the trim in other colors entirely. On a river lined with white columns and green shutters, it was visible for miles and unmistakable at any distance, which was precisely the point. The neighbors who disapproved had a name for it. They called it the Pink Elephant. Construction ran from 1852 to 1857, 5 years. The recorded cost was $80,000. That figure deserves a pause because of what it excludes. It excludes the bricks, which were made by hand on the property from local clay. It excludes the cypress, which was cut from the plantation's own swamp, including those 6-foot capitals carved from solid timber. And it excludes the labor because the labor was enslaved, and therefore, in the accounting of the time, free. Belle Grove was not purchased, it was extracted. The clay, the timber, and the hands all came out of the same ground. A house built that way is magnificent while the ground still produces. It is something else entirely the moment the ground stops. Return to the 75 rooms and to the one on the lowest floor with no windows. A cell in a private house is not decoration. It is infrastructure. It tells you that the people running this property expected, as a matter of routine planning, to need somewhere to lock a human being. That expectation was rational because of what sugar required. Sugar is not cotton. Cotton is picked over weeks. Sugar cane, once cut, begins to spoil within hours, and the crop must be harvested and processed in a narrow window between the cane reaching maturity and the first frost destroying it. That window was called the rouleçon, the grinding season. During grinding, the sugar house ran around the clock. 18-hour days were standard across the Louisiana sugar parishes. The work involved cutting cane by hand at speed, feeding it into powered rollers, and tending pressurized boilers that periodically exploded. The Louisiana sugar region had a reputation among enslaved people across the entire South, and it was not a reputation for prosperity. It was known as the place you were sold to as a punishment. Mortality was high enough and birth rates low enough that the enslaved population of the sugar parishes did not sustain itself. It had to be continually replenished by purchase from the domestic slave trade. Now put a number on it. In 1860, a healthy enslaved field worker in the Deep South sold for somewhere between $1,000 and $1,800. Andrews held 148 people. The mansion cost $80,000 to build. The people forced to build it and to cut the cane that paid for it were valued on his balance sheet at roughly twice that. This is the single most important fact in the entire story, and it is worth stating plainly because everything that follows is arithmetic. The largest house in the South was not primarily an asset. It was the visible portion of a fortune whose actual substance was human beings. And unlike land, unlike bricks, unlike Cyprus, that form of property could be abolished by a sentence of law. In 1857, the house was finished. 4 years later, the sentence began to be written. When war came, Andrews did what many planners did, which tells you exactly where he believed his wealth was located. He did not fortify the house. He did not defend the land. He took the enslaved people and fled west to Texas, attempting to move his capital beyond the reach of the Union Army. And he left his daughters behind at Belle Grove. The house was never shelled. No army burned it. There is no record of significant military damage to the structure at all. It did not need any. New Orleans fell in the spring of 1862, and with it, the mouth of the river. The sugar market, the brokers, the shipping, the credit, simply ceased to function. And when emancipation came, the 2/3 of Andrews' fortune that had been recorded in census columns as property became, in an instant, a group of free people under no obligation to return. Consider what he now owned. 7,000 acres in a region with no functioning labor system. A sugar operation requiring intensive year-round work, with no workforce willing to do it on the old terms. Pre-war debts denominated in pre-war money. And a 75-room house that needed a small staff simply to be habitable. He held on for 2 more years and then gave up. In 1867, John Andrews sold Belle Grove, the mansion and its acreage, to a man named Henry Ware for $50,000 in cash. The house alone had cost $80,000 to build a single decade earlier, using materials and labor he had not paid for. He was not selling a home, he was liquidating. According to one long-repeated account, Andrews had his furniture crated and shipped down to a warehouse in New Orleans for storage. Shortly afterward, the warehouse burned to the ground. Fire reached the contents of Belle Grove 85 years before it reached the house. Andrews lived on in New Orleans and died there in 1884, without the means to maintain what he had built. Neither his children nor their husbands ever had the money to take it back. And here is the pattern beginning to show itself. Belle Grove outlasted its builder's ability to afford it by 17 years. It would outlast everyone else's too. The second owner is more interesting than the first, and almost nobody talks about him. Henry Ware was a planter and cotton manufacturer who had made his money in Texas. He had initially backed the Confederacy. By 1864, he had turned against the war and was pushing for peace, and afterward he argued publicly that black men should have the vote. For this, he was denounced by his white neighbors as a traitor to his race, and he left Texas. He arrived in Iberville Parish in 1868 with cash at a moment when cash could buy almost anything in Louisiana, and he bought the largest house on the river. The Ware family would hold Belle Grove for roughly 65 years, far longer than the Andrews family ever did. 2 of Henry's sons eventually ran it. They lived in it, farmed it, and married into the parish. By any ordinary standard, they succeeded. They still could not save it. The reason is structural, and it is the same reason that sank every large plantation house in the region. Sugar after emancipation still required enormous seasonal labor, but now it had to be paid for, negotiated, and competed over. And the planters' response across South Louisiana was a system of wage labor and sharecropping enforced when it was challenged by violence. In 1887, a strike by sugar workers in nearby Lafourche Parish ended with dozens of black laborers killed at Thibodaux. The industry survived. The margins never returned to what they had been. And a 75-room house is not a neutral object during a decline. It is an expense that scales with its own grandeur. Every one of those rooms needed heat in winter, repair after every storm, and paint against the Louisiana humidity, which attacks a building the way it attacks everything else, from underneath, invisibly, all year. Belle Grove had been designed on the assumption of a labor supply that was limitless and unpaid. That assumption was gone. The building did not know that. It kept demanding what it had always demanded. For 50 years, the wares paid. Then the weather stopped cooperating. The end came from 3 directions at once, and none of them were dramatic. A hurricane tore through the standing cane. The following year, a hard frost split the stalks in the field, and the juice inside them turned to vinegar before it could be milled. Then came mosaic disease, a virus that swept Louisiana cane in the 1920s and gutted yields across the state. 3 bad seasons in a row will end a marginal operation. By the mid-1920s, the wares stopped operating Belle Grove. In 1925, the contents were sold at auction. The mantelpieces were taken out of the walls and sold separately. The ironwork went, the windows went. That detail is worth stopping on because it marks the exact moment the house crossed a line. Belle Grove was no longer a building being sold. It was a building being harvested, worth more disassembled than standing, which is the definitive verdict of a market on a structure it has no use for. From 1925 onward, nobody lived there. An empty house in that climate does not wait politely. Rain found the roof fed the ceilings fed the joists. A leak that would have been fixed in an afternoon in 1860 destroyed an entire wing. The foundation under the south portico began to slide. A series of owners bought it during those years, and every one of them intended to restore it. Every one of them arrived during the Depression or the war, when there was no money in America for saving anything. In 1943, the house and 17 acres sold for $2,000, $80,000 in 1857, $2,000 in 1943. The largest house in the South had become worth less than a modest automobile. And in the middle of all this, something quietly strange happened. The federal surveyors came. Between the collapse of one wing and the cracking of the portico, the government sent architects to measure Belle Grove in fine detail and photograph it from every angle. The most careful documentation the house ever received arrived after it had become worthless. It was never studied that closely in the century it was worth a fortune. The fire came at night in March of 1952. The accounts are consistent about what it was not. It was not lightning. There was no functioning electrical service. There was nothing left inside worth burning for insurance, and nothing left to steal that had not been taken years earlier. It is recorded in nearly every source with the same adjective: mysterious. Nobody was ever charged. Nobody, so far as the record shows, was seriously looked for. There was no fire department fight worth reporting, no rescue attempt, no salvage operation. That absence is the loudest fact in the entire story. When something valuable burns, there is an investigation because someone has lost something. In March 1952, the destruction of the largest antebellum mansion in the American South cost no living person anything at all. The walls stood a while longer as a ruin. In 1958, the remains were bulldozed into the ground. The land was cleared, and eventually a residential subdivision went up over part of it. It was given a name, because subdivisions are always given names. It was called Belle Grove. Today, the only marker is a plaque at the intersection of Louisiana Highway 405 and Stone Street. Stone being the name of Andrew's original partner from the 1830s, still attached to a street after the man, the partnership, and the house have all disappeared. So return to the question from the beginning: what actually killed Belle Grove? Not the fire. The fire was a formality, performed on a corpse, 27 years after the last resident walked out. Belle Grove was built out of the plantation itself, its clay, its cypress, and the forced labor of 150 people. It was financed by a leap in sugar chemistry invented by a New Orleans man of color who could never have been received as a guest inside it. Norbert Rillieux left the country and died in Paris in 1894, buried in Père Lachaise, having outlived by 3 decades the entire economic order his invention had enriched. The house's value was never really in its bricks. It was in the ledger of people who worked the cane, and when that ledger was abolished in 1865, the building instantly became what it remained for the next 87 years. The largest unheatable, unstaffable, unsellable object in Louisiana. Every owner after 1865 was, in effect, a volunteer paying for the upkeep of a monument to a vanished arithmetic. The Wares volunteered for 65 years, which is remarkable. Then the weather ended it, as weather eventually ends everything on a floodplain. The scale that was supposed to make Belle Grove permanent is precisely what made it impossible to rescue. A small house survives neglect. A 75-room house does not. It simply has more surfaces for water to enter and more rooms nobody can afford to close in. The very thing that made it the largest is what guaranteed it would be the first to go. There is one final note, and it belongs to the rival. John Hampton Randolph, who lost the competition on the river, hired the same architect 2 years later and built Nottoway a few miles upstream. It was smaller than Belle Grove. It survived through the war, through the collapse, through the century, and it was eventually restored and turned into a resort, hosting weddings in the rooms that Belle Grove never lived long enough to offer. On May 15, 2025, Nottoway burned to the ground, which leaves the drawings. Somewhere in a federal archive in Washington, there are measured elevations, floor plans, and photographs of a pink house 62 feet tall, with 2-story Corinthian porticos, cypress capitals cut from a swamp that no longer exists, and 75 rooms. 74 of them were for living in.